China is the world's factory, the second largest economy on the planet. It produces cell phones, cars, weapons, and even rockets. But behind all of this, there are people living in silence, without rest, without any choice. In less than 50 years, the country went from being one of the poorest in the world, living in extreme misery, to becoming one of today's greatest powers. All this growth, hailed as the economic miracle of the century, came at a very high cost, a cost that is not often talked about. And this debt is still being paid today with the lives and freedom of millions of people. You're about to discover the side no one shows you. Why is China so rich, yet not everyone there lives well? A country where, deep down, your life and your personal will might not matter that much. A place where you have to give your all for the future of the nation. To explain how China achieved this miracle of rising from misery and extreme poverty to the top of the world as one of the richest nations on the planet, and what the real price of that was, you need to take a deeper look at China's history. Not the story everyone usually tells, but one from a less seen angle, the side of the workers who built this China. And it all begins back in 1949, the Communist Revolution. After decades of civil war and foreign invasions, Mao rose to power and founded the People's Republic of China. It was the end of a millennia-old empire and the beginning of a new era. The promise: an egalitarian country, free from exploitation, where the people would finally take control of the means of production. The result: the start of one of the most authoritarian and controlling regimes of the 20th century. Well, if capitalism is a minefield, Mao's communism was a true mine. Step out of line, and you were done. From 1958 to 1962, something happened called the Great Leap Forward, which I like to call the leap into the abyss. Mao wanted to transform an agricultural China into an industrial power in record time. He launched a plan called the Great Leap Forward, where millions of people were forced to work in agricultural communes and makeshift steel furnaces. But the truth is that all of this was based on falsified data, forged production reports, and completely nonsensical decisions, like melting down cooking pots to make homemade steel. And the result of the Great Leap Forward could not have been different: the greatest famine in human history. More than 35 million people perished, and what remained was a social collapse. People ate tree bark, mud, and even worse things I can't mention here. While the government celebrated record production figures, which were false, the people died in silence and hunger. In the following decade, Mao took one of his last steps: the Cultural Revolution. After the failure of the Great Leap Forward, Mao had lost much of his prestige within China, and to regain power, he launched the Cultural Revolution. Students and young people were turned into militias called the Red Guards, people armed with ideology and hatred. They persecuted teachers, burned books, destroyed temples, and erased centuries-old traditions. Many intellectuals were humiliated and suffered harsh punishments for what was considered bourgeois thinking. Families were denounced by their own children. Neighbors spied on each other, and fear became a part of everyday life in China. It wasn't enough to obey. You had to love your leader, and any doubt was considered treason. But in the midst of all this chaos, in the early 1980s, a very different figure emerged: Deng Xiaoping. Mao died in 1976. The country was bankrupt, traumatized, and far behind the rest of the world. Then Deng Xiaoping came to power, a far more pragmatic leader, and pulled off one of the greatest turnarounds in modern history. It doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white. What matters is that it catches the mouse. In other words, ideology wasn't as important as actually achieving economic growth. So China began opening its borders to the global market, attracting foreign companies, and adopting capitalist practices, all without abandoning state control. It was as if they were putting a businessman's suit over the red uniform of communism. And the result of this lightning-fast transformation was explosive. Millions of people were lifted out of poverty. But here's where the problem lies. It was at this moment that the so-called sacrifice zones were born, places where the Chinese people worked until they collapsed. The country grew like never before, but the ghosts of repression and inequality remain alive to this day. The Chinese miracle. After Deng Xiaoping's turnaround in the 1980s, China traded ideological slogans for extremely aggressive economic targets. If before the priority was serve the revolution, now it was to get rich is glorious. And that's exactly what happened, but not for everyone. Mass production, miserable wages, and limitless exports. China's growth strategy was simple: offer the world what no one else could. Cheap labor, without rights, and on an almost infinite scale. Millions of peasants migrated to industrial zones where they worked 12, 14, or even 16 hours a day. They slept in overcrowded dormitories with up to 6 people per bunk. They earned pitiful wages and had no form of labor protection. Meanwhile, Chinese factories flooded the world with cheap products, from the smallest toy to the most expensive iPhone. And that's how China became the factory of the planet. But those who made all this possible barely had time to live. On the outside, the numbers were impressive. GDP growth above 10% per year for nearly 3 decades. More than 800 million people lifted out of poverty, according to international statistical criteria. But let's slow down here. This defeat of poverty did not necessarily mean quality of life. Many people still lacked basic sanitation, healthcare, and decent education. The psychological, physical, and social cost of survival was enormous. China won against poverty in the numbers, but people continued living on the edge. To sustain this growth, the government launched a wave of gigantic construction projects. Millions of people were forcibly removed from the countryside and relocated to newly built cities. Entire neighborhoods appeared out of nowhere, with shopping malls, highways, and skyscrapers, but completely empty. These are China's so-called ghost cities. And the truth is, these cities weren't built just to house people. The goal at the time was to inflate the country's GDP. The logic was simple: build, spend, repeat, even if no one used them, because growth was far more important than living well. Meanwhile, China poured massive investments into artificial intelligence, robotics, 5G, facial recognition, drones, and many other tools. Also for mass surveillance. Yes, they became pioneers of global innovation, but there's a catch. All of this happened under the watchful eye of the state. Technology wasn't just meant to modernize the country. It was also designed to monitor, and some say even indoctrinate, the population. Many tech companies follow direct orders from the Communist Party. Words, ideas, and images are filtered, deleted, banned. They control social media, and even the algorithms are programmed to maintain harmony, a different way of saying censorship. So China became a highly futuristic country, but with invisible chains, especially in the technological sphere. Chinese collectivism, the nation above the individual, stands in stark contrast to the West, which places high value on the self, personal freedom, and individual success. And just to be clear, I'm not saying every country in the West is like this, but China's growth was built on the opposite principle: the we above all. Chinese collectivism is a cultural pillar, one that was pushed to the extreme by the regime. And it's here that we find one of the greatest contradictions in China's development model. Behind these impressive numbers lies a mindset that teaches people from an early age that what you want for yourself can, and should, be sacrificed for the good of the nation if necessary. In practice, this means that a good life in China is not a life of freedom, but one of conformity, a life aligned with the state's idea of well-being. From school, children learn that the ideal citizen is productive, silent, obedient. Education in China is a brutal competition where millions of students fight for places through exams that require years of study and intense pressure. The famous Gaokao, China's national college entrance exam, determines not only a person's academic future, but also their position in society as a whole. Failing it rarely comes with a second chance. It's not common to experiment, to fail, or to take an unconventional path and still achieve success. Anything outside the official route, so to speak, can be seen as disrespecting the collective effort. This mindset also extends to the working world. Many companies operate with insane targets, abusive hours, and a culture of total commitment. The 9-6-9 model, working from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week, has become almost a norm in tech companies and factories, even though it's not an official government policy. Rejecting this lifestyle isn't just frowned upon. It's treated as laziness, as a threat to the nation's progress. It's no exaggeration to say that millions of Chinese people live to produce, not to truly live. In recent years, a youth resistance movement has emerged, known as Tangping, lying flat. It's a philosophy of rejecting social pressure, where people simply decide to stop trying so hard. I've made some videos about this before, so you can check them out in the card above or at the end of this video. But the point is exactly this. In China, collective success isn't just a goal, it's almost a life obligation. And anyone who doesn't keep up with this pace is seen as completely wrong. It's like two countries in one. The China the world sees, full of skyscrapers, cutting-edge technology, and futuristic bullet trains, does exist. But there's also another China, rural, forgotten, isolated, and almost never shown in the glossy success stories. This division in the country begins with a system called hukou, a kind of geographic ID card. It determines where you can live, study, and work. So if you're born in the countryside, even if you move to a big city, most of the time you still don't have the same rights to public services. It's as if there were two classes of citizens: urban residents, with access to healthcare, education, and city opportunities, and rural residents who can't change their status so easily. Millions of migrant workers have moved to urban centers to build a new China, but many still live on the margins, with precarious jobs, no legal right to housing, and sometimes not even school access for their children. These people are invisible, and it's these invisible ones who keep the country running. While a few get rich from the economic boom, the majority still lives with just the basics. Regional inequalities in China are huge. There are cities with GDPs higher than entire countries, and villages where people still struggle with basic sanitation. And yes, the government has made efforts for these people too. It has implemented policies to reduce inequality, such as the Rural Revitalization Program and the expansion of basic services. And since 2020, the government's official stance is that extreme poverty has been eradicated. But this is still widely debated, because the poverty line used by China, about $3 a day, is considered low by international standards. So yes, despite the government's almost miraculous advances in recent decades, many people still live on the edge of poverty, or at least with only the bare minimum, the human price of progress. China's so-called economic miracle didn't fall from the sky. It was built by force, through the sacrifice of millions of ordinary people who worked exhaustively, often giving up their own lives for goals that were never theirs. Workers who spent more time in factories than with their families. Young people who grew up under extreme pressure to study, compete, and try to fit into the job market. Retirees with no decent support. Women forced not to have children due to government policies. And ethnic minorities who were persecuted or re-educated, as they like to say, to fit the national standard. Individual suffering rarely factors into the GDP, but it's behind all of this. On top of that, state control over private life is almost total. Cameras everywhere, digital surveillance, censorship on social media, and a web of monitoring systems used to reward those who behave and punish those who disturb the order, so to speak. This can mean anything from being late on a bill to criticizing the government. Freedom has been the price paid for all this stability, and the emotional cost is now exploding. Many young people have simply dropped out of the race and begun rejecting the system, even if quietly. Indeed, China has built a global superpower, but to do so, it had to tighten the human screws of its machine to the limit. From the outside, China looks like a country that has succeeded spectacularly. Skyscrapers, high-speed trains, giant tech companies. It's the second largest economy in the world. But this image hides a serious problem. Many people still live poorly, even in a country that appears so rich, with much of China's wealth concentrated in the hands of the government and a small number of families. Inequality in the country is enormous. Living in a big city can be extremely expensive, and even those who work all month may not be able to live with dignity. It's as if there are two Chinas, the one that appears on magazine covers, rich, modern, and the one that stays hidden, where ordinary people work hard and live with little. Yes, success exists, but it's not shared fairly. And this inequality, which the government tries to hide or downplay, is growing more and more each year. China has grown like no other country in the world. It rose from misery, became a global power, built massive cities, and showed the planet that it's possible to rise quickly. But this growth came at a very, very high price. Millions of people gave up their lives, their freedom, and even their health to sustain this so-called miracle. The government became stronger, the country became richer, but inequality, suffering, and lack of freedom remain, even if hidden behind beautiful statistics. And the question that remains is, was it worth it? Can a country truly claim victory if a large part of its people still live feeling lost? Well, thank you very much for watching until the end. If this video made you think, give it a like, share it, and leave a comment below telling me what you think. There's a lot to discuss about China, and I'll be waiting for your thoughts down here as well. And I'll see you in the next video.